Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to have a look at the times when George, John, Paul, and Ringo had problems while driving. Well, first up, we'll talk about John. On July 1st, 1969, John was on vacation with Yoko, her daughter Kyoto, and Julia. And then John crashed his white British Leyland Austin maxi car near Durness in the Highlands. John Lennon had gotten his driver's license in 1965, but he was a terrible driver. He didn't do well traveling the roads, and most of the time, he didn't notice other traffic. According to BeatlesBible.com, the roads were narrow, the weather was poor, and Lennon panicked after spotting a foreign tourist driving towards him. Lennon lost control of his Austin Maxi, driving it into the roadside ditch. He, Ono, and Kyoto sustained cuts to the face, and Ono's back was injured. They were taken to Goldsby's Lawson Memorial Hospital, where Lennon was given 17 facial stitches, Ono 14 in her forehead, and Kyoto 4. Julian was in shock but unhurt. He was taken to John's aunt's house, which was 50 miles away. Cynthia Lennon arrived at the hospital and wanted to know what happened, but John wouldn't see her. She then took Julian back to London. Lennon remained in the hospital for 5 days, and he told reporters, "If you're going to have a car crash, try to arrange for it to happen in the Highlands. The hospital there was just great." The crashed Aston Martin was later transported to the couple's Tittenhurst Park estate, where it was placed in the gardens. After returning home, John went to the studio after 3 days, and then Yoko had worse injuries than John, and he wanted to keep an eye on her, so he ordered a double bed from Harrods to be put in the studio. Well, needless to say, John lost his confidence as a driver after his accident in Scotland, and I think from what I read that he never sat behind the wheel again. Next we have Ringo's wreck. Ringo and his girlfriend at the time, Barbara Bach, later to become his wife, were driving to a party in Surrey, May 19, 1980. They were driving through the fog as they approached a black spot at the Robin Hood roundabout on A3, a terrifying collision which would completely write off Starr's white Mercedes. Starr had to swerve at 60 miles an hour to avoid hitting an oncoming lorry. His evasive action sent the couple on a 50-yard somersaulting skid in the process, which resulted in his supercar colliding head-on into 2 lampposts. Despite having the leg injury, he heroically pulled Barbara to safety. Removing her from the car, Starr then comically headed back to his wrecked car to retrieve a pack of cigarettes. They both walked away with minor injuries. Barbara had several cuts and bruises and a wrenched back, but they were minor enough that she was able to walk. And Ringo said, "We had a crash. It was cool." After surviving what could have been a fatal accident, Starr felt that they were destined to be together. He and Barbara would get married in a ceremony at Marylebone Town Hall a year later in 1981, and they remain married today while splitting their time between London and Los Angeles. Now we have George's car accident. On February 28, 1972, George and Patty got into a terrible car accident, which almost proved fatal for Patty. She suffered a concussion and several broken ribs, and she spent weeks in the hospital. According to the BeatlesArchive.net, in the late evening, George and Patty left their Henley home, Friar Park, in their white Mercedes en route to London to attend a Ricky Nelson party. George's reckless driving nearly cost them their lives. At midnight, as they approached a recently opened roundabout, George collided with a lamppost on a center barrier. Patty was knocked unconscious when her head hit the windshield and she slumped over the gear shift lever. George, with a bleeding head wound, had to climb over Patty to get through her door and signal for help. George and Patty were immediately taken by ambulance to Maidenhead Hospital, where they were treated for their injuries in the casualty department. George received stitches and was discharged from the hospital. Patty was more seriously injured with bad concussion and broken ribs. She was transferred to the nearby Nuffield nursing home in Fulmer, Slough, for observation. In the morning of the following day, the Nuffield nursing home announced that Patty was quite comfortable following the car accident the night before. And then Patty remained under the care of the nursing home for 2 weeks, recuperating from her concussion and broken ribs. George returned to Friar Park after being released from the hospital and cut his hair very short after the accident, since a section of hair had to be shaved for stitches. The Harrisons' white Mercedes was a total loss, and according to Tumblr.com, July the 12th, 1972, George appeared before the magistrates in Maidenhead, Berkshire, to explain his car crash on February 28th. He told the court, "I hit a motorway interchange crash barrier because I did not see the warning sign." George was later found guilty of careless driving and was fined 20 pounds. In addition, his license was endorsed for the second time. And then we come to the Beatles in their instances where they got speeding tickets and other incidences that happened. And this is according to webgraphic.com. So they said Ringo was the first to purchase his secondhand car from the fellow Liverpool drummer Johnny Hutchison. The hand-painted standard Vanguard cost him £75 in cash, and he loved it. Ringo drove illegally for nearly a year before even attempting to take his driver's license in November 1960. He failed the test but continued to drive under the radar. In fact, Ringo would not pass his driving test until the 8th of October 1964 in Enfield, Middlesex. This time he passed on the first attempt following lessons with instructor Walter Wilcox. When Ringo's group Roy Storm and the Hurricanes was accepted for a residency at Butlin's Holiday Camp in Wales, Ringo sold the Vanguard to another Liverpool drummer, and using his first 3 months' wages, Ringo bought himself a Ford Zephyr Zodiac Mk1, which he would continue to drive for the next 3 years. Apart from his illegal driving, Ringo had so far avoided any incidents or accidents. When he was later joined on the road by his friend George Harrison, that would change. In 1962, in March, just after he passed his driving test, George became the second Beatle to own a car. His was a Ford Anglia, and he bought it with a cash deposit and weekly repayments from a friend of their manager, Brian Epstein's, who was Terry Doran. Ringo, by this point a friend of the band but not yet a member, offered to give George a lift to pick it up. A lifelong Formula One fan, George can now live out his racing dreams behind his own set of wheels. On the way back from Warrington on the 27th of March, George and Ringo raced home to Liverpool. George pulled ahead and won the race, but didn't realize that Ringo had rear-ended the driver ahead of him, who had slowed to avoid a dog. Within months, George would rack up 2 speeding warnings, only one away from being disqualified for a year. And then George would have another incident. Returning from a one-night stand at the Majestic Ballroom in Hull in the morning hours of the 14th of January, 1963, Aspinall, the road manager, let George drive while he occupied the passenger seat. While passing through a small port town of Goole in East Yorkshire, George took a turn too quickly on icy roads, slid down an embankment, and crashed the van through 7 concrete posts of Burton's menswear factory fence. Remembering the incident, George said, "The accident had ripped the filler cap off, and the petrol was pouring out. We got out and had to shove T-shirts and things into the hold to try and stop the flow of petrol. We started to push the van back up on the road when out of nowhere came, 'Hello, hello, hello, what's all this then?' It was a cop, and he booked us for crashing." When George and Brian Epstein appeared before the Goole Magistrates Court for the offense on June 12th, George pled not guilty for driving the van without due care and attention. He was fined £10. George remembered having his license suspended for 3 months, but if true, it was not reported in the local paper. So Paul seemed to have trouble with maintaining the speed limit. 3 incidents caused Paul to temporarily lose his license in the first half of 1963. The first occurred on March the 8th, when Paul was fined £5 for speeding, and he was given that at the Liverpool Magistrates Court. The second took place 2 months later at 11:40 p.m. on May 15th. Driving home from 2 concerts at the Royalty Theatre in the Roman city of Chester, Paul was stopped on the New Chester Road by the police constable Powell. Paul had been speeding at 60 miles an hour and was unable to provide his license or insurance. Powell let him go with the promise that he would produce his documents at the Allerton police station within the next 5 days, and Paul didn't keep the promise. Paul's third incident transpired exactly 1 month later on June 14th, as he drove the rest of the group home from a Mersey Beat showcase at the town ballroom in New Brighton. Flying along Seabank Road at Walsey at 55 to 60 miles an hour, Paul was pulled over at 11:45 p.m. by Constable Stephen Goodhall. Not only could he offer no explanation for why he was driving at nearly twice the speed limit, Paul was once again unable to produce a license or proof of insurance. On July the 15th, Paul was fined £15 at Birkenhead Magistrates Court for speeding, and a further £2 for failure to produce his documentation. Paul did not attend, but pled guilty in a letter to the court in which he offered the dubious but not implausible excuse that the group had been trying to outrun a carload of fans. The very next month, on August 26, Paul was fined in Walsall yet again for what seems to be the same offense. The Liverpool Echo reported that this was Paul's third speeding conviction that year. He was subsequently fined £25 plus a further £3 for failing 2 summonses to procure his license and insurance documents. In addition, Paul had his license suspended for nearly a year. He would get it back in time for his 22nd birthday in June 1964. The Daily Mirror reported that Paul was planning to celebrate by buying himself a new car. So back to George. He was in his Jaguar when he had a minor collision with a green Ford Anglia and the New Kings Road, Fulham, on his way to the Beatles concert that evening in Brighton. The 2 drivers were unharmed and got out to exchange details. George's sports car came out the worst of the 2 vehicles, with the left front side smashed in. George later explained to a reporter, when the other fellow suddenly turned right, I put my foot on the brake, but the road was wet, and though I was going slowly, the car skidded a bit and we collided. I got out and went for him. That's a nice way to treat my best car. So then in 1968, both Ringo and Paul were back in court on speeding charges. Ringo was fined £8 on May the 7th and had his license endorsed at Feltham Magistrates Court. He had been doing 60 miles an hour in a 40-mile-per-hour zone in Twickenham and rode in to plead guilty. After that, Ringo then hired a chauffeur, which kept him out of trouble. But Paul, he loved the freedom of driving, and he wasn't going to be stopped. But then he was stopped by the police on July 21st, 1968. Paul's longtime girlfriend and fiancée, Jane Asher, announced on BBC One's D-Time national television program that her relationship with Paul was over. Her exact words were, I didn't break it off, but it's finished. To avoid the press, Paul and his new girlfriend of the minute, Francie Swartz, left the same day to lay low in Liverpool. Needless to say, the press caught up to Paul at his father's house, and then the following day, at the end of the visit, Paul and Francie raced south in time for the Beatles' 7 p.m. recording session at EMI. It was while skirting Coventry that Paul was pulled over for speeding in his Aston Martin DB6. Not only was he driving between 55 to 60 miles an hour, he was also driving with a 3-month expired road fund license. In her scandalous 1972 book Body Count, Swartz recalled, a cop pulled us over and tried to write out a speeding ticket while Paul tried to charm him out of it. There was grass all over the floor, but the cop couldn't stop staring at Babyface. Paul delivered a piece of Beatle charming bull about how the cop didn't have to give us a ticket, how we could all be friends if we tried, and the policeman smiled encouragingly. He took a second look at me. I must have had a stupid stone smile because he handed me the ticket fast, as if he didn't want to think twice about what had really been going on in that car. The matter was finally settled on the 7th of February, 1969, with Paul pleading guilty by letter. He was fined £10 for speeding, £5 for driving with an expired road fund license, and £8 for back duty fees. I said Paul didn't really seem to care if he got fined or not, because after he started dating Linda Eastman, they were stopped and Paul was caught again driving without due care and attention. While navigating the roads in his Aston Martin on the 11th of May, Paul nearly hit a policeman directing traffic on the London Road in Bath. It seems that the Beatles had got carried away with their cars and couldn't help but travel at high speeds in them. They did have cars that had power, and it was too great a temptation, I guess. So George was known to be a great driver, so I was surprised when I found out how many times he was involved in accidents. I'm glad they all survived the incidents that they were in, and they could go on to have many more happy years driving. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I hope everybody's been having a great day. And be sure to click on the notification bell so you can find out when a new video is released. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.